It's totally all right. Yeah, well, so how have things been for you while we wait for folks to come in?
Well, I really enjoyed our work. I have to say, I really, really did. And I'm looking forward to, more. And I'm doing okay. It's actually gone over 65 here, so that makes me a happy guy.
Oh man, that's fantastic. Yeah, no, we here in Chicago it's warm. We kind of had like a last gasp of sub-zero temperatures, and now things have gotten
But
a little
it's
bit better.
February, so that could change.
Yes,
I,
yes,
I,
it's
I
still
left
looking good.
Boston. It was snowing in April. I'm like, I'm done here. I'm totally done
Yeah,
in Boston. I want to live there, but
I know.
um,
Occasionally it's like April showers. Like, why is this should be a shower, right? That's like the rhyme goes. Mayflowers, not April
April
snowstorms.
showers, spring May flowers. That's true. But I'm sorry, are you having a moment to your, like, what brought that up, sir? Why
Oh,
that?
I was just remember you mentioned snowing in Boston in April, and I was just that reminds me of when it snows in Chicago in April, which is always much to my
Oh,
chagrin.
right. Well, that's why you kind of come visit.
Yes, all roads eventually lead to California.
They do,
Um,
or Texas, apparently.
well,
So,
all right. Well, thank you to. Go
yeah,
ahead. Go ahead.
mm, I'm looking forward to getting to work. We have lots to talk about, so thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on my podcast and doing the show with me as well. I know, as I mentioned when we recorded your podcast a couple weeks ago, that I saw you do a presentation on TPN Health about sex addiction. I thought to myself, I need to know this man. I need to talk with this man. I really appreciate his perspective because you being an expert in this area, I feel like brings something really important to the discussion where I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding around sex addiction
Hmm.
and other process addiction, like we spoke about before. So I was hoping you might be able to just get us started by just really weighing in on the idea of what is a sexual addiction and why is it a valid construct. I know there's been some debate, perhaps not amongst clinicians, but amongst the
30
general public.
years amongst clinicians, 30 years. People have been throwing mud at each other for 30 years deciding what to call something. And I'm like, you know what? Why don't we just work on it? But that's me. But yes, there's lots of debate
Yeah.
and discussion about what to call this. And basically, the difference in the
Mhm.
field has been, is it compulsion? Is it addiction? Sex can't be addictive. It has to be drugs and alcohol to call it an addiction. And so there's lots of debate. And I think part of the deal is when it comes to sex, people they bring their own agenda. It's very easy to bring your own agenda, your own feelings about sex into it. So I think that has driven,
Mhm.
so, if I were a drug addict and alcoholic and you asked me about drug addiction, alcoholism, or if I was a counselor in that area, I don't think there'd be a lot of debate. I think we would understand what it is, and whether you use the word substance abuse or I use the word addict or alcoholic, we pretty much know what we're talking about. But when it comes to compulsive or addictive sexual behavior, there is a lot of debate about more about what to call it, and we can talk about that. But once you get underneath the name, the behaviors are the same, the issues are the same, the treatment is the same, and the history of how you get here is the same. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's mucky mucks being mucky mucks in the academia world.
So where do you draw the line when if you're doing a consult, you're talking to someone
Mhm.
who might be wondering like, does my partner have a sex addiction, or when is somebody addicted to pornography? Like where do you draw the line for that?
Well, it's interesting because people will say to me, well, how much sex do you need to have in order to be a sex addict? And my answer is, well, how many drinks make an alcoholic? How many glasses of wine? We don't really gauge someone's problem by how much, how many hours they spend gambling, because what might be healthy for some people isn't healthy for others. So we don't gauge it by how much. And then people say, well, what kind of sex? Maybe if you're into this, or you're kind of into transgender, or you're into S&M, or that must be addiction. And especially when it's unwanted, like I don't like that this turns me on. For some people, sexual orientation, like I'm married and I have sex with lots of people, men, and I don't want to be homosexual, so I'll just call that an addiction. So we don't decide, I don't think any addiction by how much or what kind. With alcohol, you don't say, well, if they drink whiskey, they're an alcoholic, but if they drink wine, they're not. And it's the same in my world. So I'm not interested in how often you have sex. I'm not, I mean, I am in terms of the work, but I don't define your problem by how much, and I don't define your problem by what kind. The way I think we define
Mhm.
all addictions, and sexual addiction is part of this, is how is this behavior or substance affecting the functionality of your life? So, if I'm having sex in a way that is, I end up giving STDs to my spouse, if I lose my job because I am having sex with coworkers, if my kids walk by when I'm looking at porn on a regular basis, if I'm clearly seeing that I'm beginning to have meaningful real life consequences in my world and my life, and yet, like any addict, I push them aside. I don't see where it really comes from. I don't take responsibility. And so sexual addiction, to me, like gambling addiction or gaming addiction or any of those behavioral addictions, and maybe the substances too, are really about how is this affecting my ability to meet the goals in my life, to achieve what I want to achieve, and to what degree is using or acting this way undermining the things that are important to me. I guess that's
Mhm.
how I would define any addiction. So it doesn't really matter whether we're talking about sex or gambling or gaming, it's all the same to me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it, and really mirrors how I like to think about addictive behaviors, whether or not that's a substance that you're consuming or a behavior that you're engaging in, but more of like, is this actually in line with your goals for what you're shooting for, your values about who you want to be as a person? And if it's not, and you're feeling that conflict, does it seem compulsory? Are you doing it even though there's some sort of penalty, there's some sort of consequence to it?
And I would
So
add
it's
to that, and thank you, Dr. Weiner, because I think we mirror each other in a lot of ways on these issues.
Weiner,
But
I'm gonna correct you early on that
oh,
one.
I'm sorry, I'm going to do that wrong. So, can you edit? You can't edit us. So here we are. Sorry about that, Dr. Weiner.
It's
Um,
all good.
there's a long, long way to figure that out, those E's and I's. But
No worries.
I was going to add to your comment, which is, people have all kinds of sex and they have consequences. Things happen. Someone gets arrested, someone loses a job, someone has problems with their spouse. But that's when we start talking about compulsive behavior. Because yes, it's true that what I do may bring consequences, but as an addict, I don't see those consequences. So if you said to me, is your sexual behavior ever having problems with your job? I would say, no, the boss is just really this or that. If you ask me, excuse me, why I'm having sex with strangers, I would say, well, my wife, my husband, I would find reasons to blame it. So while people with addictions do have challenges with the function of their life and their values and their goals, they're not always aware of it until it becomes a crisis. So that
Mhm.
spouse comes on, picks up my phone and realizes that I've been having three affairs. I've been hiring sex workers for the last 12 years of our marriage, and I've been writing to other women that I think I care about them and I'm unhappy in my marriage. And thank you for the sex. It was great. Um, when I see those multiple arenas being affected and someone is almost always hiding, and I think that's another piece of it is compartmentalization, meaning I live
Mhm.
this life with my family and my loved ones or as a single person, but then I have this secret sexual life that no one really knows about and that I live separately. So I am kind of emotionally distant in my family because I have secrets and I have things that I'm hiding and I have a few issues. And then over here, I'm having a lot of sexual intensity where I feel admired and appreciated, have a sense of control, but that's not intimate and emotionally intimate. So with my family and the people I love, I'm keeping secrets, so I can't really get close to them. After all, if you said to me, "You're a great guy," I would say to myself, "Oh, but you don't know what I was doing yesterday." So I can't really take that in from the people I love. And then I do all this stuff over here, which is kind of like eating potato chips when you're hungry. I can have as much sex as I
Yeah.
want, but it's not going to fill the emptiness inside of me. So it's kind of like that, the compartmentalization, the secrecy, and it's even more amplified, as you can imagine, when we're talking about sex.
Yeah. But well, so then question for you, where do you think the debate around this comes from? Like, well, the way that you're describing it sounds absolutely like any other sort of addiction that we work with. The secrets, the compartmentalizing, the lying, the potentially feelings of shame and hiding and distance and disconnection. But why do you think that people feel like it's not actually an addiction, but might just be, something that
Well, I can give
that's
you,
minimized?
Dr. Weiner, I can give you the reasonably not too long answer about that, but it isn't a short one. There
Yeah.
are some heroes to me in the sexual health field, and we do actually have a field. I have a PhD in sexology, and it's been a developing field for at least 40 years or so, or if you go back to Kinsey, really even longer. And what some of the heroes in my field have done is they have posed the question, what is wrong with whatever kind of sex you want to have in the privacy of your own home or with another person that is completely consensual? So that argument pushed, let's say, homosexuality, which was extremely considered pathological and sick and all of this, and it helped move the culture to, what these people are doing in private, it's consensual, it's nobody's business. With transgender issues, for example, which filled with shame, really hidden, lots of pathology, they were able to move the field toward what people do in their bedroom and the privacy, what they do together. If it's consensual, is up to them. So, other than consent, there has been a huge attempt, and I think very successful, to move these things we call pathology or illness into health. And basically, the way that's happened is you can do whatever you want as long as it's consensual and not illegal. The problem is that doesn't work for every issue. So when you deal with behaviors that are problematic, that go over the top, that are causing the kinds of problems that the people I work with have, you can't use that same line of thinking. You can't say, oh, well, if they're doing it in the privacy of their own home or they're doing it online, who cares if they have 100 partners and they lose their marriage? Because it's consensual. But I know that the people I work with have profound early abuse and trauma. I know that they're really struggling with compulsion, meaning they feel driven to do things, compelled to do things that they know are not good for them. That is their consent? Yes. If they stood back and said, is this a good idea for me? No. And so the idea of consent, which has moved us into a beautiful world of acceptance around most of our healthy sexuality, has not worked for this. Because if you're compulsively being sexual and it comes out of trauma and abuse, then you can't just say, well, it's okay because they're okay with it. I mean, you can say that, but ultimately, when you look at what it's doing to people's lives and the addictive quality of it, it isn't that you cannot use the same argument for that. And so I think part of what goes on in the sexual health world is they say, well, sex is being pathologized, homosexuality, transgender. And so this is just another form of pathologizing sex. Now people have too much or too many partners, or so this whole push to make everything healthy, it works against this particular issue because it's not healthy and it's not good for people and it does destroy their lives. And on some psychological level, they really don't have choice. They feel driven to it. So, one of the big things in the field, as I said, is the way that the sexual health folks have done a wonderful job of normalizing a lot of sexual behaviors that were not considered healthy in the past. But there are some that those folks have not wanted to look at. Well, they really don't want to look at any kind of sex as being problematic. And of course, for some people, this behavior is. The compulsion issue, I think, is uh, compulsion addiction. I think the addiction piece, let me say it this way, I'm so sorry. You and I are taught about, let's say, drug and alcohol disorder, what we would call drug addiction, working with the source material that we have as therapists that help us define what is a problem. They call alcoholism and drug addiction something. They call it substance use disorder. And that's what the person is told. You have a substance use disorder involving alcohol. But if I have the problem, I don't run around the world and say, hi, everybody, I have a substance use disorder. I say I have an alcohol problem. I'm an alcoholic or I'm a drug addict. And in the same way, we are developing, and there already is in Europe and most of the world, a definition, a diagnosis for compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So there is actual scientifically based, criteria based, research based material that now says this is a problem. And I think some of the younger age porn issues, which really started coming up in the last 15 years, have pointed toward this could be a problem for some people. Um, However, it has, sorry, I would not walk around the world if I had this problem and say, oh, Dr. Weiner, I have a compulsive sexual behavior disorder. I would say I'm a sex addict or I'm a porn addict. So to me, the translation issue is the problem, is that in the mucky mucks and the academics, we want to give it these names. But when you get to the common man, he or she wants to call it, or they want to call it what the familiarity that they experience it. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that's some of the challenge is how the general public looks at it. And trust me, no alcoholic is ever going to say, well, actually, I need to call it substance use disorder. They're never going to say that. So in some ways, that's how it worked out. And then there are other things about the addiction world that are worth talking about, but I'll take a break for the moment.
Yeah,
Because you
yeah.
like to
Well,
talk
well,
all day.
absolutely. Well, yeah, that's what happens when you're passionate about something. But I see what you mean about how there's this divide between the professional world and then the real world. And I feel like when it comes to whenever you're using something to access for the purposes of coping, it's helpful sometimes if there are like anchor points or behavioral anchors or consequence anchors where you can look at it potentially and say like, oh, this is I'm talking here in particular for the general public, but where you can look at it and say, oh, this behavior feels like it's excessive. This it's like it's over and above. And part of what I found so interesting about the construct of sex is that the vast majority of all humans have some experience with sex, yet at the same time, like what you're describing in terms of the secrets or the dozens or hundreds of sexual partners,
Compartmentalization, the loss of
yeah,
meaningful life goals, all of that.
yeah, yeah. You'd think that that would trigger some collective agreement in terms of like, wait, but this behavior does seem like it's gone over the top, in terms of the consequences, the frequency. But yet at here we are where sex addiction is not as recognized as alcoholism or opioids or anything else.
Well, when you talk about the research and what I talk about research, we have neurobiological research that shows us that people with compulsive or addictive problems with porn, for example, their brain lights up in a completely different way than a healthy person who's looking at porn. We know that some of the chemistry and hormones that are released when someone is using a fantasy-based excitement experience to escape, like gambling, like gaming, like spending, that their brains are driven, if you will, or there's a an inability to make good decisions because as this excitement shows up, as this adrenaline shows up, it becomes harder to make good decisions. And
Hmm.
so um, what I think drives the science forward and the reason why this is now being accepted, I don't know if I said this, but the World Health Organization in 2018 asked for a diagnosis. And that's why we have compulsive sexual behavior disorder. The only folks who don't use the manuals that are put out by the World Health Organization are North America, United States and Canada. We have our own journals. So my point is that it's research based and clarified enough for almost every country in the world to see it as a problem. And I know
Hmm.
it will make our way soon, but it'll make our way as a compulsive problem. Um, but that doesn't play out in the real world with people.
Yeah.
I also want to say also that addiction has a lot of stigma and sex has a lot of stigma. And so when you put the two together, a gambling problem might have one but not the other. A gaming problem may seem like neither. But when you talk about sex, ooh, what does that mean? And then when you talk about addiction, ooh, what's that about? And then I think people are understandably frightened. If you say, I have an out of control sexual behavior, now I could say it's compulsive masturbation and going to sex workers, but what comes into your mind when you have children? If I say I have an out
Hmm.
of control sexual behavior, the first thing you think of is, oh, this is the guy who's out, standing in front of the schoolyard waiting to grab my kids. And there are
Yeah.
very, very, very few sex addicts who escalate into offending behaviors. But that's
Hmm.
kind of how people think about it, if you will.
Right. Well, and even just comparing, like, the Super Bowl was on yesterday, and when I think about the ads that we saw for, like, in particular, alcohol and gambling both, yet we're not seeing ads for pornography or sex workers or those sorts of things. It seems unthinkable, right? But at the same time, these are all coping behaviors. These are all activities that can become more compulsory or addictive in nature.
Well, I
But
don't
I
even
want
think
to.
we see ads for condoms. At least only during the height of HIV did we see that.
That's a good point.
So it can be very basic. Um,
Yeah. Well, so here's a question for you as well. As long as we're talking about modern society, and this is something I know for the folks who I've worked with who are struggling with a sex addiction or pornography addiction, this has been a huge stumbling block. And that's cell phones. And that cell phones have opened up a whole new world of access for pornography, for accessing massage parlors or sex workers or all these sorts of things.
hooking
How,
up,
when
hookups.
yeah, even just
Mhm.
yeah, hookups with apps and dating apps. How do you help folks navigate both having a cell phone and trying to alter their behavior if this is a struggle for them?
Well, there's two pieces of that. I mean, one is that sex and eating are naturally occurring functions. right? We don't want to stop having sex. That's not healthy. We don't want to stop eating. And yet we know that there are people who have disorders in those areas. So what we do is we concretize. We sit down and literally create a contract and we say, oh, here are your goals. Here's what's going on in your life. Here are the problems you've had related to sex. What sexual behaviors are profoundly problematic and lead you off the rails into this behavior? And then we look at what are sexual behaviors that are healthy and have never caused you problems. And we create kind of a contract. And the reason I bring that up is because drugs and alcohol have their own contract. It's automatic. You go to AA, NA, it's no mood altering substances. When you go to Gamblers Anonymous, it's no gambling, no gaming, no fantasy football, sorry, no stock market, no unsecured debt. But when it comes to sexual behavior or eating, we have to do more defining. And that is between the person and whomever they are working with or being supported by. And I do want to say that adds one other thing for me. There's lots of alcohol around. If you have an alcohol problem, it's not hard to find. I remember when I was a smoker, it wasn't very hard to find information about. So I think left to our own devices as addicts, as people who are addicts, it's very hard to fight off an impulse that is so powerful by yourself. And this is one of the reasons why I heavily lean into the word addiction, because addiction implies that there are 12-step and support programs you can go to, like AA or NI. In the sexual health world, it's Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. And what you find there are groups of people with the same issue. You may be a doctor and I may be cleaning the streets, but when we come together around the problem, we are the same person. We have the same issues. And what I can find in those rooms is two things. One is accountability. So yes, I can go out and have whatever sex I want as a sex addict, but I need to check it out with someone else. I need to run it by, just like I would say as an alcoholic, is it okay to go to this party because there's going to be a lot of alcohol served and there may be drugs there? And I would run that by someone in my recovery and they would say, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. People are alcoholics, their decisions around alcohol are not very good. So they need a program, a community to help keep them aligned, get support, and to be accountable to. It's really the same in my world, which is a lot of the folks I work with, and this is going to sound really strange to the outside world, but they don't go and have sex unless they check it out with another person that they are working with, they're getting support from, could be a therapist or a sponsor. And then oftentimes when they're
Mhm.
done having sex, they check in afterwards, and this is how it was. When you're an addict, you're unable to make good decisions on your own. That's part of being an addict. And you can convince yourself all kinds of things are okay that really aren't. But when you have a group of people who are working on this too, and you can call someone up and say, I'm thinking about this. Do you think it's a good idea? Then I have accountability. And that's what shows up in those 12-step meetings. The other thing I wanted to
Yeah,
say, and
yeah.
this is very important to me, is that addiction is a chronic lifelong illness. It will come and go under stress. It will come and go without being attended to. And you know as well as I do that people relapse and they have to get back up and start over again and all that kind of stuff. So if you have a chronic lifelong problem, I'm not going to solve that in 2 years of therapy. If I have diabetes, I can see you regularly as a doc, but that's not going to cure my diabetes. And we know that addiction is a chronic lifelong problem. People can only go to therapy for so long, and they may work through things and they may get a great plan. But what about 5 years from now when I struggle, or 3 weeks from now when I struggle, or if I struggle for 2 years? I can't keep going to an expensive therapist and I need to find a community where I can turn to. And I think this defines 12 step anytime. Sit down, go online. I say I need help. People will be there for me. They will let me have their phone numbers. They will go to coffee with me. And that isn't, I'm not paying them anything. So by calling yourself an addict is not really the kind of stigma that people think it is. I think it's actually a gift because it offers two things. It offers a lifelong community of support, and it also helps me understand that I'm not a creep. I'm not a weirdo. I'm not a bad person. A lot of people have this issue. I can work on this issue, and I think the idea of addiction gives people hope because now I can identify my problem. Now I can work on my problem, and I can even find a community who will help support my problem throughout my life. And that just doesn't come along unless you use the word addiction.
Mhm. Well, that's a fair point. I think there's been a lot written about the question of like the power of labels and what direction does it push people in. And I think that but ultimately, I know where I land on it is that I try to emphasize that people should do what feels empowering, good for them. I know some people really do not appreciate the label of addict. I know some people really use it as a source of strength. And so I think putting the options out there and then having people go with what resonates with them, I know is something at least that I subscribe to. In terms of, I want to circle back if it's okay, because I would really love to drill into this just for a second, because I know I even have this question. Back to the question of the phones, because you mentioned the community
Oh,
though.
right.
It,
Sorry, I mentioned that.
no, it's okay. I know that the phones, the community helps so much in terms of, like you're saying, being able to check things with others, be part of a social structure that's supportive. The problem with phones is that it's like right there in your pocket. And with the case of alcohol, like, yes, it is everywhere, but people can still make that effort to not have it in the home and have to go out and buy it. There's some opportunity there to make a different decision, whereas the phone is
I
like always in your pocket. And so
I think
I'm
you
wondering
can
how,
put I think
yeah.
you put a filter on the phone. You can put a
Hmm.
filter on the phone. There are tracking devices that if I go online, you as my therapist will see every place that I go. And so I'm accountable to you for everywhere I go online. Again, there's accountability to a community. There are various ways to, and let me say this, Dr. Warren, if somebody wants to get around something, they will. People are incredibly imaginative and creative. They will always find a way, especially addicts, to say, oh, I wouldn't do that. And then they're out the door doing it. So I think the biggest piece that comes with all of this is motivation and commitment. I have to really be motivated to change my behavior. I have to really understand what the cost is to me if I don't. It's interesting because, I've been doing this for 25 years and I've been doing it with the same population. And I probably treated 1,000 men and a bunch of women. I've run a women's program as well. This is not just a men's problem, by the way. And I can tell you, out of that 1,000 men, 995 of them came in because they were having a crisis. They were going to lose their marriage, they were going to lose their license, they had been arrested, they were in trouble, and mostly marital, by the way. Wife-driven and husband-driven referrals are my number one source of referral because the spouse says, I'm done, I'm not going to take this anymore, and you need to go get help, etc. But five out of the 995 men have come to me and said, I want to be a better person. Everyone, by the way, comes into treatment says I want to be a better person. But then when I ask them why they didn't come to me see me 2 years ago, well, last week my wife or at work. So it is unfortunately the consequences of the problem that drive people to say, I don't want to have those consequences anymore. And I don't want to live this double life. And I don't want to have these secrets. And that
Mhm.
now consequences doesn't change someone for life. In other words, the immediacy of the pain of the consequence, my spouse being angry, that goes away over time. So I have to learn how to live differently because if I don't, those consequences are going to keep happening. Um, so the phone, I have to be willing to put a filter on it. I have to be willing to block it. I have to be willing to make a call, but when I'm going on online and let people know where I'm going. I have to be motivated to do the work it takes to be accountable. So no, I can't make someone not use their phone. They need to use their phone. I can't make
Mhm.
someone not keep alcohol in the house either. I can't make someone not go to the casino. Addicts
Yeah.
make decisions that are not good for them. But oftentimes, that's the nature of addiction compulsion. You know it's not a good idea, but you end up doing it anyway.
Yeah, well, and I like the idea of a filter, and I don't know if you feel comfortable endorsing any in particular about how to do that, but to me, I almost feel like it's more like any level of resistance or delay you can put in there can be helpful. Like as an example, I know that for a lot of folks with alcohol who choose to use Antabuse or disulfiram, of course, you could just not take it, right, and then drink,
Mhm.
but you still have to wait a day or two. Otherwise, you're going to vomit all over the place. And sometimes just knowing that it's got to be that premeditated means that if you get an urge in the moment, you can't just act on it, and that can
Well,
have
some
value.
people do, and then they end up getting really, really, really sick. And then they
Yeah,
learn, oh, there's an immediate consequence for this. And then either they keep taking the pills and stop drinking, or they stop taking the pills. But
right.
most of my experience is alcoholics need to try, does this really work? What if I just have a glass of wine? And then they end up really sick. But that's a major consequence,
Yeah,
right? I don't want to be sick like this. But anyway,
right. Well, that's a good
please
start.
continue.
Oh yeah,
You
yeah.
mostly
No,
work in drugs and alcohol, right? I mean, that's your arena.
I do. I
So
do. That's where I get most of my patients. Yeah.
I think the idea of a process addiction is not so familiar to most people. They understand when you put something in your body, like alcohol or drugs, it will change your thinking, it will change your neurochemistry, it will change a lot of things. And as you said, people use it to escape or make themselves feel better or all that kind of stuff. Um, it really isn't that different with gaming and gambling and sex and food. We call them process addictions. It's not just the sex that drives me. It's not just the winning at the casino. The whole process is exciting. The making time for it, the going online and choosing my sex worker, getting the money aside, making sure nobody's home, driving there, all of that escalates the neurochemistry that I'm talking about. So by the time I'm there, I'm not thinking clearly. I'm not even able to think clearly. And
Yeah.
that understanding that someone can be behaviorally addicted is not just, in fact, here's a good one. I don't think my clients are addicted to sex. I think they're addicted to the idea of sex. Because if you think about it, at least the people I work with, they spend 80% of the time fantasizing about it and planning it, and 10 or 15 or 20% actually having the sex. So what it's really about is losing myself in fantasy and behaviors and rituals because I'm already escaping before I even get into the act. And that's different than drugs
Yeah.
and alcohol a little bit, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's a fair point too. That's another very common thread I hear from the folks who I have worked with sexual and sexually related addictions, like with pornography, that there's a whole ritual to it, and the ritual and the excitement of the ritual is almost better in some ways because that's not associated as much with the shame, which is another very common thread that goes along with it. Like they don't feel the shame as much for the looking and the lead up as they do about actually the act and then afterwards having to deal with the feelings that come from it.
Well, in fact, one thing that I've always helped people when they call me and say, I want to go do this XYZ, they're only thinking about how exciting it's going to be when they actually see the sex worker or when they actually get on the porn or actually call the affair partner. One of my jobs is to say, well, how are you going to feel after? What's that going
Hmm.
to be like? What are you going to be? Are you worried about an STD? Are you going to take a shower before you get home? Because when addicts are thinking about behaviors or substances, they're only thinking up to the point of the great excitement, right? They're not actually thinking about what's going to happen after. But as you
Yeah.
said, and I think this may feed into the first question about sex addiction, is that most of the people I work with, when they sexually act out, afterwards they feel shame. And part of the
Hmm.
sexual health world says we don't want anyone to feel shameful about sex, right? We want them to feel good about their sexual lives. The reason that people I work with feel shame is because they've been on this neurochemical high that has left them making decisions that are not good for them. And then when that high is over, they've had their orgasm. All of a sudden, it's like, oh my God, I'm 3 hours late, and I spent money I needed for my kids, and when am I going to take a shower? And what if I have an STD? All those thoughts come rushing back in that the chemistry and the excitement and the intensity pushed out. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so that brings me to another question that I selfishly wanted. You're going to find there's a lot of these today of questions that I
Can we
selfishly
talk
want to
about your
ask.
sex life, Dr. Weiner? That's the part I really want to get into. That
My,
was a
well,
joke.
I
That
don't,
was a
yeah,
Rob
yeah.
joke, a Dr. Rob joke. You
Maybe
take
not on
things
the
and you
live
like, oh,
stream.
well, right. Okay,
A-
fine. Just talk
After
about.
we go off the edge, but for clinically for my work that I'm very interested in, it has to do with the side that aspect of the shame and how people can turn the page. I know that in my work around with both addiction and then also potentially other behavioral health conditions, there's this part where there has to be almost like a letting go of the past in a way where you can conceptualize yourself now potentially as like different in some way or as a different person in order to make a break, move forward, kind of like turn the chapter if you want to pull some narrative therapy into it. From your perspective, what works? And let's just stick for right now with the person who's coming for help as opposed to families. But how does one actually turn the page from those behaviors that they judge themselves so harshly for?
Well, every patient I work with comes in kind of in denial, doesn't see how bad it is. Part of my job is to show them the reality of what they've been doing. You did this how many times? What has your spouse had to say about it? What diseases you were out during COVID? And then, all of the pushing through their denial. And I'm talking about treatment now, because right, I run a treatment center seeking integrity here in California. And I have men who come in and their problem is their wife is angry at them. Their problem is, the affair partner. Their problem is, but they don't really see the underlying issues or the frequency or the money or how it's affecting people. And once they do, which is my job to push them, they feel awful. And that's where all the shame is. How could I do this? I'm such a terrible person. I hate myself. I thought I loved my spouse, but look what I'm doing. And that's not helpful because
Yeah.
self-hatred is nothing. I can't help somebody who hates themselves. I can't really. And the reason they hate themselves, by the way, is they think they're bad people. How could someone do this? How could I do? What was I thinking? All of that stuff again that comes when you're done with a rush. And I would say a little differently than you. I ask them to embrace their past, which is instead of saying I'm a bad, broken person and I'm just going to hurt people and I'm a sexual weirdo, what I will say to them is, wow, but let's look a little bit at your past. Let's look at how you were raised, what happened to you. Was there abuse? Was there neglect? And 99.9% of my clients have profound abuse. The men who were raped at 7 and abused when they were 9 and all of that kind of stuff. It's not all sexual abuse, but and when they're able to realize, not even work on, but realize, oh, really bad things happened to me. And I learned certain things about relationships and making myself feel better because of that trauma. That means I'm a broken person. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person. And I can't really help bad people, whatever that means, but I can certainly help broken people. And when they move from I'm bad to there's something wrong with me, well, then I can say, yeah, there is, and look why it happened, and let's work on solutions. And if you just say you're bad, what am I going to do with that? So my goal in terms of moving people from shame into a different kind of feeling about it, which I'll call guilt, is by helping them understand that they got there for a reason, that they're not bad people,
Mhm.
but the influence of their past has left them making really, really bad decisions. And ultimately,
Yeah.
Dr. Weiner, my experience is that the men and women I work with, they have an intimacy disorder. It's not just about the sex, it's about the challenge on the other side, which I am unable to deeply become intimate, not sexually, but emotionally intimate with the people that I love. And that comes from, early abuse and all of that.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff we do in treatment, but I got to move people from shame to guilt. And
Yeah.
guilt
Well,
is useful.
oh, guilt is very
Guilt is
motivating.
useful
Yeah.
because it tells me, oops, I made a mistake. Don't want to do that again. Makes me feel bad. But shame is I'm a
Yeah.
terrible, horrible person and I'm unredeemable. And there's not much I can do with that.
Right. Like the difference between I did something that I feel is bad versus I am something bad. One is like a state problem and one is a trait problem. And I think that ultimately, like, I completely agree with you, by the way, about the utility of looking at the past and saying, I did what I did for a reason. Maybe even thought it's what was necessary at the time, or I thought it's what was best at the time, or what I had to do, or I had a different set of
Or was
values.
just instinctual for survival.
Yeah.
It wasn't even something I thought about. It's just a lot of the men I work with had such difficult times growing up that they learned to lose themselves in fantasy. They learn
Yeah.
to think about other things in their head, to go other places. Some of them touch themselves when they're very little in order to just feel better. At an
Mhm.
early age, when you develop those kinds of patterns, they don't disappear when you're older. They just kind of go underground. And so
Right.
imagine the person who used fantasy and emotional escape to get through an abusive circumstance, and they just kind of went away into that place over there, TV or whatever, to escape. And now they're sitting in front of a computer by themselves with porn. It naturally makes sense that they have now moved to this more intense fantasy as an adult to escape what's going on in their lives. But it's really the same thing they learned when they were little, which is find something to focus on and get out of my feelings.
Right, which is that this idea of wanting peace or wanting pleasure is a very human, normal, natural thing to want. It's just the question of the strategy that you're using to get it, in my opinion. There's some that are more
Can you
harmful
say
than
more about
others.
that? Because I understand strategy. Tell me what you mean
Oh,
so I can understand better.
well, so if the primary motivation is not, say, sex, maybe the primary motivation is feeling powerful or competent, or if the primary motivation is
Control.
finding control or peace, there's a lot of ways to get at that need. Then sex is the strategy that one might use to get there, or alcohol is the strategy that one might use to get there, or gambling, or like that big win, or whatever it is. And ultimately, the need at the core of it is something that isn't, there's nothing wrong with that need. It's just how
No.
are you going about meeting it?
Well, I learned, let's say if I'm a sex addict, as a child, I learned to avoid looking for attention, avoid asking people to take care of me, avoid having needs, and because no one's going to meet them. And so that belief in me that I really am not worthy enough for people to meet my needs and I'm going to be alone with them, it's called shame. No one's
Mm.
going to love me, no one's going to take care of me. I don't know what's wrong with me, but they're not responding to me. And throughout the lifespan, that becomes shame. Um,
Yeah, well, and I know
by the
you
way,
mentioned a lot of addiction as being an attachment disorder, and I thought that was a really interesting way to put it. It's a disorder of attachment. And does that get at that idea of people are not, I'm not worthy of being loved and taken care of? Is that what you're getting at with that?
yes, but I think earlier, meaning it's not even a thought, it's an experience. Um, I think about the kid who is sitting in the kitchen with mom and she's busy and he, throws the oatmeal spoon on the floor. He's 2.5. And mom says, "Now, sweetie, you're not going to be able to, get it. And I'm going to put the spoon back up here. And, you got to eat." And she goes back to what she was doing. He throws the spoon on the floor. I'm sure you know this from your kids. And he's not doing it because he's a bad kid. He's doing it to
Yeah.
see what he can do to get mom's attention. How powerful is he that he can throw this on the spoon and mom will come rushing over and do something nice? Or make him feel better.
Mhm.
Or I have a boo-boo on my leg and mom comes over and makes it better. But if mom says, "I don't have time for you," if mom says, "You're bad and shut the F up because I don't have time for you and go to your room," then what I learned is there's something wrong with me for needing things. If I just didn't need anything, then I wouldn't upset mom. And so I don't learn how to rely on other people in the very most basic level. You and I talk about something called basic trust, which is the earliest stage of development when we learn to trust other people to meet our needs. And I think this is a big piece of my clients lack basic trust. The
Mhm.
challenge is that, you cannot go back and have the brain you had when you were 4. I'll always have this problem because it is such an early part of my development, and my brain has like a seashell developed layers and layers on top of that, that I can learn how to live differently. I can see my behaviors. I can learn how to see the signs, work with them differently, get support. But the impulse, the desire to escape, to hate myself, to find a solution by myself without relying on other people because they'll let me down or hurt me, I mean, that starts at a very, very early age. I think most of the men and women I work with had profound problems with relationships with their caregivers when they were 2. It's long before someone is conscious. By
Mhm.
the way, I do want to avoid parent bashing because, in our field, people are saying, "Oh, it's always the parents. It's always their fault." And the truth is that I think every parent does their best to love their child as best they can. But there are some parents who are not able to meet the needs of the child. So they may do the all out best, everything, but that child may have needs that that parent just isn't able to meet for whatever reasons. So I don't
Mhm.
blame the parent. I just say they did the best they could, but there are certain things that person needed that they weren't able to get there. And so they learned certain lessons that aren't as functional as the person who had more support and consistency when they were young. Um,
Yeah.
and this does come from somewhere.
Mhm.
By the way, as you know, there are genetic elements to addiction as well. Um, And some people are primed to be addicts, but they don't become addicts. Other people are primed to become addicts, and they do.
Yeah.
So there's a lot. We could talk about this for days.
Yeah, well, there really is such a mix of what goes into to making this happen, but I think that central point that when I again I heard you say that in that training, and I was like, yes, that's so on point, is this idea that really a lot of this has to do with attachment and feeling. And this question of, will someone else be there for me? Will the world be there for me, my loved ones, or do I just need somehow to deal with my pain or my discomfort on my own? And I think one of the hardest parts about emotional problems, as opposed to like just mostly like thinking or appraisal problems, is that our emotional mind does not speak the language of
Right.
language and logic. It speaks the language of experiences. So to
Well, it's
trust
in a
it,
different part of the brain, right? It is
right.
emotions and intellect are in different places.
Right. They're located in different places and you have to work with them differently. And the catch 22 about emotions is oftentimes you have to do something that your brain doesn't want you to do, like say, be vulnerable, put yourself out there
Hmm.
in order to learn, oh, I can trust this. The world might not be as harsh and unforgiving, or at least this relationship, as I initially thought it was. And that's really hard. It's really threatening.
Well, those early experiences set the tone and the model for how we live later. I was going to say something else to you about the addiction, which is I'm not. How do I say this? I think that, and I'm curious whether you agree, that everything that is addictive has a use in day-to-day life, and it has to do with our survival as a species. So alcohol has always been there. It's been a social lubricant. Perhaps it's helped people get along better, or it helped them get along to have babies. Eating, obviously, has always been there. Sexuality, always been there. Competitiveness and gaming, always been there. Community building, relationships, always been there. Um, all of these functions are really meant, and we're driven to them. They're part, to build community, to have sex, all of that for our survival as a species. You don't mate, you don't eat, you don't do so well as a species. The problem is for addicts is they turn to these same behaviors for what you and I would call secondary gain. So meaning if I go out with friends and have a glass of wine, it helps me relax, spend time with them, and I'm feeling good. It's been a hard day. But if I'm an alcoholic, I look like everyone else, but I'm not drinking for the same reason. I'm not drinking to relax and enjoy time with my friends. I'm drinking to get drunk and escape. So the same behavior, which many people do, and is not a problem for the addict, they're doing it for different reasons. And that's why when you're alcoholic and someone says, I don't understand, how could you drink a half a wine and just put it down, half a glass? And then the non-alcoholic says, how could you drink half a bottle? I could never do that. They're really talking about different things. They're looking for different things. And I think it's the same with the sexual issues that I deal with.
Yeah, well, and I agree. I mean, I think that there's the reason why addictive substances and behaviors are pleasurable is and reinforcing is because they can do something for you. There's use cases for a lot of stuff. I mean, maybe not some things like the additive that we're seeing a lot with fentanyl right now, xylazine, like that could
Uh,
cause like necrotic flesh, and it's like maybe not so much like injecting xylazine, but a lot of things, even fentanyl, right? Like that's used in surgical procedures all the time. It's not that there's not a use case, but the question is why are you doing it, and then sometimes also in what context.
well, and the person is using, maybe they need more, they don't have the ability to rest inside. They don't have the ability to have peace inside. They have the ability to quiet themselves, which we
Yeah,
all need. But they turn to the substance and it supplies those needs that they are not able to generate within themselves.
yeah. Well, I want to come back actually to the question of trust, but in this case, I want to
Mm,
ask you a question about trust from a partner and what that healing process looks like, because that's oftentimes there's this wreckage of a relationship, oftentimes, or something holding on by a thread left behind when someone's been engaging in this behavior, oftentimes in secret for a prolonged period of time. It's just been discovered 95% of the time, like you said, that's what ushers people into treatment. And so I'm wondering from your extensive experience in this area, how do partnerships move forward from these sorts of revelations and problems? What does that process look like?
Well, I think we really understand how to work with addictions and what is required for the addicts, and it's a very structured, almost behavior-based. Do this, call. It's almost medical. Do this when you're in trouble. Call that person. Here's when you have a sign of the problem. So we really work sort of hand in hand with the client to guide them in a particular direction. Spouses have other needs. They need to be supported and comforted, and they need to come to terms with what they've been through, and they need rest for having carried the family or whoever it is for a long time. The problem, I think, in our culture is we haven't had very healthy methods of treating families. So we have tended to blame them. And the word I think of is codependency, which is, I get people in a treatment center. I finally got the addict husband, let's say, into treatment. And then we invite the family and the wife, using that example, into the family program. And they sit down and say, well, let's talk about what's wrong with you. Your mother did this and your father did that. And basically what we're saying to the families is you are encouraging the addiction or supporting the addiction, or and that your early issues in life are now playing out in the relationship and they are pushing you to create problems in the relationship. And that just makes me crazy because I don't think that I think where families are coming from is love. And I think they stay even when there's abuse to do everything they can to try to rescue and save their families. So, when codependency says enmeshed, I say deeply loving and committed. When codependency says nagging, I will say doing whatever they can to affect change. So what I'm interested in is turning this model that says, what's wrong with you for having married an addict, sticking with an addict, and now you're encouraging the problem. I want to flip to, of course you stay with this person. You love them. And no one ever taught you how to deal with addiction in high school. So I guess you're doing the best you can. And I think part of that strength building and support is acknowledging spouses and family members for what it takes to live with an addict and stay with an addict. And yeah, if I work 3 jobs and I give up recreation and I gain 30 pounds and I nag all the time and I'm controlling, you could say there's a problem with me that drove the addiction. Or you could say, wow, I'm really being affected. by the addiction. And all these crazy behaviors you're seeing are because I've been living with this for such a long time and it's so painful and difficult. And that is a theory I call prodependence, or let's hear it for dependency rather than questioning it. So that's
Mhm.
how I look at it.
Yeah, and for viewers and listeners, Dr. Weiss recently wrote a book called Prodependence. Check it out. I did read it.
Oh, yeah.
It's absolutely worth it. Worth the
Thank you.
read. Yeah, no, I did actually, and you kindly offered to give me a copy, and I bought it anyway because I know how hard it is that the book industry is.
But if you bought it, you can write a review. So just letting you know.
Oh, that's a good point.
But
Yes,
not if you don't buy it.
I should get on Amazon and do that.
Can I
But
say
yeah,
that
go ahead.
I do read the reviews, and the idea of prodependence has been I have everyone I talk to or read about. I love this. This makes me feel better about myself. I've had parents, when I teach this, come crying to me after and say, "You're the first person who told me it's not my fault that my child died." It's to that degree where we blame partners and family members as if they had a part in the addiction. And I do want to say that
Yeah.
for everyone who's listening, I think it's really important, is that no one can make me use. You make me be miserable. I may hate you. You may gain 300 pounds. We're married. I can go for a walk. I can divorce you. I can go into therapy. I can get a hobby. The logical conclusion to being unhappy in a relationship is not to go drink. That's a decision the addict makes, or not to go have sex with strangers. So I think we have some unreasonable expectation that somehow the pressures and issues that the world puts on an addict makes them use. And I think addicts are making a decision, which is this is how I want to handle this situation. But we all have stressful situations. The choice to move to addiction is that person's alone. And I say this to all the families who blame themselves and all the spouses who are walking on eggshells thinking, oh, well, I've got to act this way, or they'll drink, use, or sex again. It's really, they had this problem long before they met you.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I think it's important as well to acknowledge that there are certainly some behaviors that can protect someone from consequences of actions. And I think that, and you really tread this line very well in the book in saying that what someone does without knowledge of the construct, it's not like you should be blaming them or stigmatizing them for that. I think the
Wait,
first
I'm
thing you
sorry.
have to do.
I'm so not complex. So you have to help me understand, especially people who don't understand the construct. Can you just kind of explain that more simply? Because I get lost in that.
Oh,
What do you
yeah.
mean?
Well, no, the idea of that we shouldn't be stigmatizing folks for what they do before they necessarily know about addiction. And of course, they're being affected by their loved one's addiction and they're trying to make things right. There's oftentimes, and I guess we should dive into this a little bit more. My perspective, at least, on the process of making your way to the point of wanting to change an addictive behavior is starting to see it more and more as the cause of a lot of your problems and to feel the natural negative consequences of your actions. And sometimes family members can unwittingly, essentially, protect people out of love, like you're saying, from those consequences that otherwise might be very motivating towards
Right.
change. And that's sometimes, but they don't know that. And it feels so counterintuitive. And I think that's where the
Look,
problem comes in.
I mean, I completely support you in this area because, let's say my wife is drinking, or let's say my boyfriend, or in my case, my husband, is drinking like a fish, and they fall down drunk in front of the house. Well, I don't want the neighbors to think my husband's drinking. I'll say something like, oh, he tripped on a step. I don't want them to look at me with this, or my family with the shame of addiction. After all, who sends their kids over to play in the house where dad's and where the father's an alcoholic? So yes, families cover and they cover up, but what they're doing is they're protecting their family. Like they are trying to keep that family safe. They're trying to keep stigma out of their family. So again, yes, the problem is that what they're doing enables, if you will, the addict to keep moving forward with their behavior. But I don't think the partner is doing this because they want to live in the problem any longer, or they want to keep the problem under wraps, so that I think they're doing it because they're trying to protect their families. When you flip it
Mhm.
around to all the negative behaviors that we see in spouses, partners, and families are really merely an attempt to hold on to their attachments, to hold on to
Yeah.
people they love, and hopefully get the family right again. Look, if you
Yeah.
had cancer, Dr. Weiner, and we were married, I would do anything. I'd put my life completely aside I would drive myself insane I'd lay my life on the line trying to help you because I love you. And yet, if I love an addict, You're not going to cheer me or see me as a hero. You're going to say what's wrong with you because you lived with them, you supported them, you enabled them. And addiction is the only arena in mental health, I believe, where people turn to family members and say, let's look at what's wrong with you. Now,
Mhm.
I'm not saying people don't have issues, and they don't share their issues with each other. Have you heard my two Mary Sevens story? I don't want to tie us up. I don't know how long we have.
I don't think I have. We've got 5 minutes left. I've got one more
Okay.
question for you, but if you want to tell the story, please shoot.
It's really quick. So a lot of times with the issue of codependency, someone will say, "Oh, well, you married or got involved with this person who has all these problems, and if you don't really work on yourself, you're going to end up with, and you leave this partner, you're just going to end up with someone with the same issues. And so you've got to grow, you've got to change, and that's important. But here's how I look at it. If you're an emotional two, you're just kind of a mess. And you were dating and you run into an emotional seven, stable, reflective, owns their own stuff. Twos look at sevens and say they're boring. I don't want to go out with them. I want to go out with someone who's exciting. And the seven, who's got it together, looks at the two, who looks a little crazy, and says, "Oh my God, I would never want to date with them. They're too crazy." And so we're always going to meet people and engage people at a similar level of functioning emotionally and psychologically. What I tell those folks is two things. One, that's not a bad thing because two people working together can grow faster, I think, than each of us individually. Partnerships and family is a very good thing. But there's Rob's rule, Dr. Rob's rule, which is don't date or go out with people who haven't done some of their own work. So they need to be able to say, this is my part, or this is what I did. They need to have had some therapy or 12-step work. I don't want to be in a relationship with someone who, when I complain, I'm upset, they say, well, there you go again. And they don't take any responsibility for their own behavior. If you say,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you this morning, I let you down, but then I can be in this relationship and we can grow together because we may act our stuff out, but we're learning from it and we're growing together. Um, Twos are
Mhm.
not going to marry sevens, but that's not a bad thing because two fours can become a six. There, I'm done with all that. If that makes any sense at all, that was my story. Tell me your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I appreciate the perspective. Well, the question is, it's a little bit of a re-question, but I would love your insight on this. Something that we hear a lot in addiction, but I feel like this at least I've heard it even more on the sex side, has been this trust recovery curve where there might be someone who said like it's been this long since I've acted out on those impulse, like it's been 4 months, 6 months. I can see my progress and my partner is not trusting me yet. They're still wanting to check my phone. They're wondering where I am, and it's not necessarily that the patient or the client that they're frustrated because like on the one hand they get it, but on the other hand they're wondering like what do I need to do to help move things forward again, to regain the trust, to actually get back or maybe move forward to a place where they're not always wondering like what am I hiding. And I guess my last question for you really is like what are the strategies that you recommend to help reestablish the trust in that relationship when it's been broken so severely in the past?
Well, there's a number of answers to that. When it comes to sex addiction, once this has happened in a relationship, the relationship will never be the same, ever. Because if you're my partner and I have this deep, enduring belief that you would never go out in the world and not only do something to hurt me, but deliberately, like go see a sex worker or whatever, that's gone. Now I always know that you're capable of going out in the world and hurting me. And that naive belief in the relationship, it goes away for sure, forever. The to your point, 6 months is nothing. 6 months is a drop in the bucket for a partner who wakes up after 20 years of marriage and finds out that someone's been cheating for 19 of them. And that's very typical in my world. So, one of the things I find is addicts want forgiveness quickly and they want the problem to end because they are uncomfortable and they don't want to see that angry face. And they have been working really hard and they think they should be cheered for, and they should, but not by their spouse who they betrayed and hurt. There's no trust there. I can't turn to you for support if I don't trust you're not going to rage. You can't turn to me for support if you're the one who ruined my life. So for trust to be reestablished in my world, a year and a half, and that's provided the person with the problem is not still sleeping with sex workers and not still having affairs, and the behavior has to have changed. A partner may not believe that. To me, the
Mhm.
key in any addiction recovery for people who are in a relationship is not any word that's said. because words sound like, I'm sorry, please forgive me, I didn't mean it, I have these issues, can I take you to dinner? Can I buy you flowers? And surely it's been, and I have the guys like, it's been 3 months since I betrayed you 100 times. Why aren't you over it yet? That doesn't go over so well. In fact, I wrote a book about this called Out of the Doghouse, a relationship saving guide for men caught cheating, because no man I've ever met has any clue how to heal betrayal in a woman. So that's why he's in the doghouse, or she. Well, he in this case. But the other piece is
Yeah.
that in order for me to trust you, I need action. I don't believe a word you say after you lied for me 19 years, but I believe you're going to therapy. I believe you're reading those books. I believe you're taking those classes. I believe you went to that treatment center. When I can see that your actions are trustworthy and consistent over time, that's how trust is
Mhm.
restored. But when you find out I'm lying to you again, everything goes back to zero. And I got to tell you,
Yeah.
Dr. Warner, I have clients who forgot to take out the garbage. And they say to their spouse, oh, yeah, I took out the garbage, but then they take it out the next morning or something. That spouse is enraged because they say, look, if you don't tell me that when you took out the garbage, how could I ever expect you're going to tell me when you have sex with someone else or go back to drinking? And so that issue of trust
Yeah.
becomes so, it is the backbone of relationships. And um, without trust, couples are never the same. And trust has to be
Yeah.
regained over time with support by consistent behavior, not anything I say.
Yeah.
How's that?
I, I
Does that?
that is a
Yeah,
fantastic answer, and definitely also speaks to that idea that we were talking about earlier of speaking the language of experiences. They need to experience you being different, not hear about how you're going to be different or how you are different. They need to feel it. They need to see
they've
it.
heard all that before.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, so to stick the landing here, aside from grabbing one of your 11 books, which is outrageously impressive, how can folks hear more from you or get in touch with you? What's the best way to reach out if they'd like to talk a little bit more?
Well, there's a couple of ways. I have a blog, sorry, a podcast called Sex, Love, and Addiction. Sex, Love, and Addiction. I think we've had 1,000,003 downloads, which means a lot of people who are concerned about sex and addiction. So you can always listen to the podcast. My name is Dr. Rob Weiss. You can find lots more detailed information with me speaking on YouTube. And then our treatment program is called Seeking Integrity. So I am Rob at seekingintegrity.com. And just to say it, we have a dozen groups that are free online. I try to get lazy therapists who want to give something to the world, who will run a group for a year, oversee a group for a year to get for people to just support each other. Because people need a space to walk to where they feel safe and someone is monitoring. So, I try to give as much as I can away on podcasts, doing stuff like this and the books. But we also run a program, residential, which I think, we change people's lives. And
Yeah.
I want to tell you something, Dr. Weiner, just for you. When I work with people who have children,
Mm.
in some ways, I don't really think that the life changes I'm making for them are as important for them. What I'm thinking about, if I can really make a difference in their lives, are their children. Are
Mm.
they going to be different parents? Are they going to be more attentive? Are they going to be more engaged? Are they going to be more compassionate toward each other? Because kids are watching. Kids are watching. And if I can improve that relationship, then maybe that child will have a better life. And I love the people I work with. I want to help them. But if they got kids, and you know this because you have them, that is the most important thing to me. I love my work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you do
Well,
too. Because addiction isn't like schizophrenia. It isn't like bipolar disorder. This is something where we see people move quickly. They heal quickly. They stop the behavior. They work through their shame. They heal their relationships. That doesn't happen in a lot of mental health in that way. So I feel blessed to be able to help people really change their lives in a relatively short period of time.
yeah. Well, 100% agree. It is incredible, and that's initially what attracted me to the field, is that even though this is a chronic condition, relapsing and remitting, you can actually make pretty dramatic changes in a short period of time with the right support and the right program, the right way to move forward,
And the right
um,
therapists.
and the right therapists. So, on that happy note, thank you again, Dr. Weiss.
Oh,
Thank you so much for coming on the
gotcha.
program. Thanks to all who took the time to tune in this afternoon. Take care, and we'll catch you guys again soon.